People have found me useful for things for much of my life in various ways. When they had legal problems, I would solve those legal problems, and when there was some kind of issue with an employee or something like that, or when the studio called and had a problem, the lawyer didn't want to deal with it and the other producer didn't want to deal with it. Boy, I was very useful in dealing with that sort of stuff. Gosh, am I useful. Very useful. But one thing I've been especially useful for in life is being the extra man at dinner parties. Somehow it seems, especially when women host dinner parties, which they do, it turns out that they always have, like, an extra woman there who, and people like for things to be boy, girl, boy, girl. So, hey, I get invited to parties like that. I'm talking about dinner parties. There are other kind of parties, it doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about boy, girl with those. Not at all. So, a woman friend invited me to a party, someone who used to invite me to parties a lot, but then again, she's not the only one who invites me to dinner parties. We're talking about dinner parties again here. And as usual, at that particular party, I was the extra guy, And there was a woman there, and we started chatting because the other people were couples or, whatever, and I think the kind of idea was, well, maybe she was a little bit lonely or whatever. My job, in a certain way, was to chat with her, and it was far from unpleasant. But as people often do, and this is the thing that has inspired me to do this particular kind of impromptu, offhand episode, is that she had a story to tell. And I'm not going to repeat what that story was. It was sort of a family story, let's just say, on her part, and it was ongoing. And it didn't have anything to do with illness, let's just say. And it didn't have anything to do with money or bankruptcy or anything like that. It was a family saga, a family drama, something which, as a movie producer, I kind of never got into doing, although there have been some great ones, mainly by Ingmar Bergman, but we'll skip that. Observation on my part for a moment. So she told me this long family drama, saga. It wasn't exactly a saga. It was actually kind of mundane, but I got the feeling after speaking with her for a couple of minutes that this was pretty much the core of what she thought about. And everything in her life somehow related to this. And I said, well, if I were to start spending time with this woman, and we didn't have any kind of rapport and certainly no kind of attraction. Attraction is a rare thing, believe it or not. The great Ornette Coleman, the great alto sax and occasionally tenor sax player, had a box set of his works that was called Beauty is a Rare Thing. Beauty is, in a certain way, a rare thing. Physical beauty and attraction is an even rarer thing. So we're talking, and that was the evening for me, and it was very pleasant. My hostess was a great cook and always has great food, and I brought some nice wine because that's the kind of guy I am. And the evening ended, but it set my mind to thinking in a certain way. And it struck me that this was the core of what was going on with this woman's life. And I didn't feel we had any great rapport or anything going on, but having heard this story, it made me think, as things do from time to time. I hope that doesn't surprise you. It made me think that everyone's life is a soap opera. In a certain way, we live in this, it's kind of like these interlacing soap operas all around the world. And we think about even the people on the covers of the People magazine, and there's a profusion of these things where you're always looking on the cover for all these actors from TV shows from who knows way back when, the 90s. God, a lot of us weren't even born then, but I mean these old actors and old rock stars and all this, that, and that and the other thing, sometimes old politicians to blah, blah, blah. And they have soap operas about their lives. Who is seeing who, and who's cheating on who, and are they going to get married again for the 18th time? Or custody fights and battles and all this sort of thing. But you step back and realize that, as I said a moment ago, there is this interlacing network of soap operas that go around the world. Everywhere you look, someone has a soap opera. Soap opera involving their job, soap opera involving their parents, soap opera involving their children, soap opera involving friends who either disappeared or came back or whatever, soap operas involving money, soap operas involving homes and moving and vacations and house decorations. Soap operas, needless to say, involving affairs, but they tend to be a little bit sub rosa. You don't see them. They're not talked about that much, except sometimes they are. So I started thinking about this, and I thought, goodness heavens, it was worth making a quick comment here on Explore Ecstatic Sensuality of this as a kind of factor in how people get along, people meet. I'm taking a sip of coffee. Oh, by the way, before I go on, I should say that this same woman had another party where I met someone else, another woman, and it was sort of a setup, and it turned out much differently, even though we didn't ever have a relationship or do anything like that, but that was a really good thing. It really worked out very well, because we had a lot of things in common, and we were and are still very supportive of one another in what we do. Back to this whole notion of the soap opera. We all have jobs, or we have school, or we have things that we do, generally jobs for, most people, or big projects, things from which we derive money. Maybe we are fortunate enough or depending on your point of view, to not have a steady job, but, sort of doing freelance work, or maybe we have investments that we manage, lucky you, or we own properties, or this, that, and the other thing. People do stuff, and they go along living their lives like that, and it's either interesting or dull. I envy the person who's really, really fascinated by their job is whatever they do. Freelancing is such and such. Or people who are very enthusiastic because they're superb tax experts, or maybe, hard to believe in about this sort of thing, maybe they have law practices that are really fascinating and fulfilling. Or maybe somehow they manage to turn the creative thing that they do, and I've known a number of people like this, a woman who does remarkable art and photography, who sells things and has things in museums and bought all the time. And these are really people who are blessed in their life. They're blessed, is that the right way of saying it? In their lives, who are able to do things like this. They manage to use that word, monetize their dreams. Wouldn't it be nice if one could monetize one's dream? Like stick one's dream into the slot at the ATM for a couple of seconds, and out comes money. That would be pleasant. But that is sort of not the average person, the world being what it is. It's not the average person, not you and me. So we go about our lives with these things, the minutiae, the boss and the payments and, the yard, that needs to be taken care of, the car that needs to be taken care of, family member, if we happen to have older parents that need to be taken care of, the family situations, mom and dad finally, after a miserable marriage, are getting a divorce, and where do you stand on this, sonny? Whose side are you going to be on, sonny? Some people grow up their entire lives like that. And which parent are you going to take the side of? Goes back sometimes to early childhood. I kind of understand that sort of thing. Or parents or siblings or close friends who develop drug problems. I never had a drug problem. I remember the first time I heard the expression OD. I was in college, and I was very naive. I was taking a poetry class, and as always, there was a very attractive young woman in that class. I still remember her very well. Once upon a time, I picked her up hitchhiking with her boyfriend at the time. Beautiful, beautiful woman. Her name was Karen Flynn. Are you out there, Karen Flynn? Are you a podcast listener? Boy, I had a thing for you. But that's, the sort of thing that we do in our lives, and it kind of takes up time. And then there's this thing called entertainment. And entertainment takes all kinds of forms. It's people like television. People keep it on all the time. I kind of don't like television. I don't keep it on all the time. That's me. I'm weird. People used to go to movies, not so much anymore, unless you want to see Spider Hunk 5. Is it Spider Hunk? That's what it is, right? Spider Hunk. Anyway, these are the things that people do. They have hobbies, which are very, very nice. I do too. And sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between a hobby and your real life. That's what's that statement? Study something that you really, really like, and because there's not any jobs in the field. I'm getting it entirely wrong. But that's the kind of notion. So there's all kinds of people out there, and we have lives. So for that other part of life, the part of life that is beautiful, the part of life from which we get emotional support, the part of life which involves someone who will really appreciate it in a whole different way than your boss might or might not appreciate you, your coworker might or might not appreciate you, your parents, for heaven's sake, might or might not appreciate you, your sibling might or might not, your neighbor. Oh, neighbors can be a trip, man. Your neighbor might or might not appreciate you, or might hassle you, or might wonder, are you dragging my property down because you're not keeping your garden up enough to make the whole neighborhood look attractive? I mean, there's all this stuff going on. Sometimes it's very tense. It's interlocking. It's interweaving all around your neighborhood, all around your job, all around your life. And if, godforsaken person that you might be, you get involved in activities in your neighborhood or in your life, you're into politics, or you're this, that, and the other thing. All kinds of stuff. But there's another part of you. What's that other part of you looking for? You're looking for, as I said a moment ago, a kind of acceptance, a kind of validation that you're not getting from any of those other things. Yeah, lucky people get it from their parents. Yeah, lucky people get it from their bosses. Yeah, lucky people, even get it from their rabbis or priests. I'm an Episcopalian. We have priests. We don't have ministers. They wear robes and stuff. It's kind of nifty. But anyway, some people do. And I understand that rabbis, for example, can be very, very good at that sort of thing. But, unless you're really, really lucky, and even if you are, there's that special person. The special person that many of us are looking for, who will really give them that kind of validation, that kind of warmth, that kind of feeling that they really get you. Your boss may appreciate the sales you did last month or the projects that you brought in. As a movie producer, I understood that. Film production executive. They may appreciate little bits and pieces of you which largely relate to what reflects well on them without detracting so much from their personal egos. It's very important not to detract from your boss's ego. That limelight belongs to your boss, baby. And if you don't give it to her or him, boy, you're in big trouble. Unless you've got some kind of weird kind of leverage, or, your best friend owns a hedge fund, but what are best friends anyway? So back to what you might be looking for. That beauty. That person who makes you feel that you are the only you. That you are the only you. There was a place I used to shop when I was living in the outskirts of Minneapolis, hardware chain called Menards. And there's a famous statement you heard a lot a few years ago: be yourself, everyone else is taken. And that turned out to have originated in an advertising slogan for Menards hardware stores. It's amazing what you can trace things back to. But we're returning to that special person. We're returning to that person who has a beauty. For me, that is always a physical beauty too. And I know I'm told the beauty can be inside. Well, a lot of things inside, intestines, sinews, a lot of stuff inside. Nowadays there's viruses too. A lot of stuff inside, but there's got to be something on the surface, at least for me. There's got to be a beauty, and sometimes it can be very unique. It's possible. I've been in situations where I've found women very attractive, and I was kind of maybe like the only one or one of the very few, but generally it's a beauty that people... I have my own style. I don't necessarily go for the supermodel type, or that that beautiful person, in terms of beautiful on the inside in general, I'm looking for a person who's congenial, simpatico, creative, someone who I feel will appreciate me in a certain way, but that's not less important, really. I'm looking for someone to appreciate myself, to be that special outside person for that person. And then there's this, weird kind of deal called love. And then there's this even weirder kind of thing called physical intimacy. Physical intimacy. Caressing and all the things that we sometimes talk about in this here podcast. Sensuality. How much of your life is really sensual? Well, have a good meal, the special kind of stuff, and that's sensual. Or there are certain kind of fabrics that feel sensual. And some kinds of music are sensual, or people tell me, and some are not. And for me, the experience of going hiking and feeling the wind against my skin, and just the feeling of the tiredness of, climbing up a long hill or disappearing into the strange trail. There's a sensuality to that too. There's a very much, I got to stop myself here and say that there's a sensuality with my relationship with my cats. That's very sensual, big time sensual. But it's the sort of sensuality that you have with that special person who is your co-sensualist. That's a term I just invented. I quite like it. Your co-sensualist. The person with whom you can indulge, as I confess I kind of do with my cats anyway, but for a human being to indulge in that co-sensuality. It's not even so much something you can call shared. It's something that here's another word I kind of hate, it's organic. What's a good word that I'm looking for? If you're following my train of thought, I think you know what I'm reaching for. There's that kind of person. And that is not a person, and I feel in saying this that I'm not being generous, that I'm not being as open-hearted and tolerant, that's a good word, tolerant as I feel I should be. But my soap opera of my life, I know that they're going to be exposed to it. And the soap opera of their life, I know I'm going to be exposed to it. And the soap operas of their parents and their children, if any. There's all kinds of soap operas out there. But the relationship that I think we all strive for is that private relationship. Is that a terrible kind of word? And it doesn't mean becoming a social isolate. That is not what I'm talking about at all. Quite the contrary. But those moments that are distinctly personal and not burdened with this web, this interlacing, as I said a few moments ago, interlacing web of soap opera, interlacing web of soap opera elements. Soap opera characters all tend to be kind of archetypes, but in a very kind of stupid kind of a way. They all have that look, and they all talk that way, and they're dramatic in that sense. And the funny thing about soap operas, it's not funny, it's kind of sad, is they're not really dramatic. I'm talking about personal soap operas here. They're all kind of like a big drag at some level. And they're kind of tedious. We live in a world of great tedium. The things that we think about and do and talk about, and car repairs and taxes and problems at the office. And it goes on and on and on. But, the interesting thing is, except it's almost interesting when a person comes in like a really mean boss who can be dramatic. Sometimes in personal relationships you get somebody who's a drama queen or drama king. That can be fun a little bit, but not. Well, yes and no. Maybe take a pass on that one. But the tedium of soap operas, the kind of drama I want in my life. There's a kind of is it drama? There's an intensity, and I'm going to use the word. There's a passion a passion to being with that person, who is the person with whom you have co-sensuality. And that co-sensuality can be love. And I think love is accepting that you're kind of going into this personal co-sensual space together, where sure, there are rules and there are boundaries. There have to be. There have to be rules and boundaries. They're necessary rules and boundaries. One does not exist without rules and boundaries. But the way of dealing with rules and boundaries, the way of discussing them, or even if they're not quote-unquote discussed, even if a lot of things are nonverbal, one can be in a situation, in a relationship, if you want to call it that, in an interaction, in a co-sensuality, where the usual kinds of abrasive verbalizations that people use are essentially absent. They're essentially gone. There's a mutual understanding, but again, even the word understanding sounds too verbal. There's a harmony. Well, that's a word that gets thrown around. Is it a good word to describe what I'm talking about? I don't know. And there is an ongoing sense of playfulness and fun. Playfulness and fun. Can you dig it? And you see couples like that. It's more like you see them from a distance a little bit sometimes. Couples who are engaged in playfulness and fun. And they have kids, and the kids join in the playfulness and fun and all that sort of stuff. And you wonder, sometimes you think it's all a show. You're shopping at Trader Joe's somewhere, or you're in a park somewhere, and you see this little family, or just a couple with a kid or two, a child or two, and there's this playfulness and fun, and you kind of think, well, assistant director and somebody doing the extra casting must have done a really good job. We're going to have to hire them on our next show, because this is it's ideal and it's silly. And certainly, once they get back to their trailer park where they live, or once they get back to the nice standard issue suburban home, like the place where Dougie Jones, if you know what I'm talking about, a little obscure reference, and his wife lived outside of Las Vegas. And once they get behind the door of that, man, all hell breaks loose. They hate each other. They were just put for our amusement out there just so we can feel envious of that little happy family. But, back to the deal. Back to the deal of finding being with that special person. But it's not like that. It's like this is the person. One allows oneself to be open to the idea of being set up with someone or just meeting someone. You go online to these dating services. I once did that years ago. I think I talked about that in a previous context. And I got someone who worked for me, and it was kind of a big joke, because I wasn't even going to admit to going on to this dating service. This was quite a while ago. But the fact that I had gotten her, she was a great employee, and we're still friends, and she did her job really, really well. She was really, really smart. Lots of good things to say about her, but we both thought that we were the most incompatible people in the entire universe. So years later, what happened? We ended up having a relationship. It wasn't a particularly successful relationship. This is a funny story, funny aside. But the whole notion of what are we looking for? We're looking for sex. Sex is nice, I guess. Should be nice. Should be nice. If somebody has sex with you just because they think, well, it's time to have sex, we've been hanging out, or maybe we've been dating a little bit, or maybe there's some kind of sense of obligation. Well, it's time to have sex. Now it's time to get into bed. Now it's time to take off my clothes and let you have a look at the merchandise. What is all this stuff about? What is all this stuff about? There's an element of tenderness to co-sensuality. There's an element of tenderness to sex, a respectful tenderness. There's an element of being really, really, really conscious that it's a really nice thing to turn the other person on. A really, really nice thing to make certain that they're enjoying it, and not just to prime her, let's just say, to make sure that she's going to agree to the sex act, whatever that act is, whether it's oral sex or people like it, people do it. Who's to put it down? Or intercourse is standardly defined. The guy needs to do things. They call it foreplay. I wonder if there's also an aft play. Don't want to go down that road. And then they have sex, but in a certain way, it's all physical. Maybe not all physical. Maybe there's some little smiles and little kisses that aren't just, those big erotic tongue all the way down to the genitals kind of kisses. Although, those are nice, but I mean, we're looking at something that is a tender, co-sensual encounter, and it's kind of like, it's not like you're both floating down a river in a raft and the waves are, pushing you along, and at the end of the thing there's this big waterfall. You're going down, and maybe you're paddling, but you don't have to paddle anymore. It just goes down. The little raft is going down. And then the waterfall. You fall off the edge of the waterfall, and that's the big orgasm. And then in the films, it used to be that the guy always smoked a cigarette, invariably. And if you can't show the sex act in films of that day, but you want to tell the audience that they've had sex, they've really had intercourse, the guy smokes a cigarette, even if he's fully clothed, as people often are and were in movies of that era and still are today. People have been in bed having sex, and ostensibly having sex just moments ago, and the sheets and covers are pulled back, and they're both wearing their underwear. And a little kid watching something like that is going to say, wait a minute, how can you... What I understand about having sex involves things for which clothing removal is necessary. Is it true that as soon as adults have intercourse, they immediately put their underthings back on, the panties or shorts or whatever style the guy, jockey shorts or whatever the guy, briefs, whatever the guy wears, instantly after having sex? I think maybe I felt like that as a kid, because when I saw movies like that, man, it didn't make any sense to me. But at the end of the day, movies made no sense, which is exactly why I went into the motion picture industry, to be in a business that makes no sense. Never did, never will. So this is my little rumination about things like this. This ongoing, interlocking soap opera of things that goes on all around us. I may make that movie because it's so ridiculous. So many little stories without passion or meaning that people are so wound up about, but not even in a dramatic way. It's all like a big drag. It's all really tedious. It's all really pointless. Except, maybe people end up with the house. Or both, usually the house and the car. And the groovy vacation. Where do people want to go on vacations anymore? Well, they don't go on vacations anymore so much. It's like there's a prize at the end of all of this. We're all in it for the payoff. People are in it for the payoff. And they just go through unbelievable rigmaroles to reach that payoff. What the bleep? What is it that they're doing? So, romance, silly. Co-sensuality, silly. Tenderness, silly. That nice, warm feeling of getting into bed and just feeling that other person's body beside yours. And maybe you do nothing. Maybe you caress a little bit, kiss a little bit, but just that feeling of warmth. We're warm-blooded animals. Let's take advantage of it. I told the story in another podcast about watching two rattlesnakes, what do they call it? There's a word for snakes having sex. So they're intertwined, sort of like standing on their two tails, like the caduceus. And I watched for a few minutes, but I was a little bit afraid to go on with my hike, but I eventually did. They were so distracted. So I went down the trail a little farther, and an hour passed, and I said, okay, they got to be done by now. They weren't. They were still at it. So I said, okay, I don't want to pass these characters because, maybe they're so distracted by having sex, or maybe they're not. So I went back down the trail even longer. Came back an hour and a half later, they were still at it. Goodness gracious. But I mean, what is all this? They don't have warmth, and we do. We do. Or are they just obeying some kind of evolutionary genetic command that they're getting from inside? Do we have those commands from inside? Well, I guess some people do. Some people do. I think both men and women more than men, say, okay, it's time. It's time to have sex. And in movies, people talk about this, occasionally. Well, now it's tonight that we're going to make our second child, whatever. It's that kind of thing. But it's like an imperative, a genetic imperative, Darwinian evolutionary imperative that these people feel. With all of the furor and effluvium, to quote somebody, rock singer, I think. With all the furor and effluvium of life, all the tedium of life, all the minutiae of life, all of the nitpicking little details and stupidity of life, agonizing repetition. We don't like repetition in this podcast, and yet people have a compulsion to do it. Freud called it the Wiederholungsdrang, the compulsion to repeat, repetition compulsion, which he allied with the death drive, which was one of his greatest discoveries, if not his greatest of all time. A realm where there isn't this kind of desperate repetition, this kind of desperate concentration on things which, if you let them slide for a moment, everything's going to collapse somehow. If the bill isn't paid, if the sitter isn't called, if the car isn't fixed, if Jenny, or whatever the wife's name is, doesn't get her dishwasher that she really so desperately wants, she's going to leave me. If I don't make enough, if I don't get a raise so that I can buy her the car that she wants, she's going to leave me. And flip that if you want to. In the modern world or in any world, flip that. If he doesn't stop drinking, I'm going to leave him. Whatever, it goes on and on. There's a constant soap opera going on. And all of us, I think, need a respite. A respite of that real respect, that real tenderness, that real co-sensuality. That feeling that here's an animal I can be with. I'm kind of addicted to some of these animal videos. We talked about this before in a previous podcast that you see on YouTube sometimes, and the way that animals express love amongst themselves. It's quite beautiful. Some of it is just a little bit like that genetic imperative we were talking about before. Well, we're going to be nice, and then we're going to have sex and do whatever animals do to have sex. They do it in all kinds of different ways. Let me tell you, it's like some animals don't even need that outside individual. Many snails don't. They're hermaphroditic, or whatever the right term is. There's a term for it. Parthenogenesis, I think, something like that. So here we are with just a brief rant, if you want to call it that, on the subject of soap opera. And on the subject of how endemic, the word that's come back into our vocabulary big time, on how endemic soap opera is to our lives, on how suffocating soap opera can be, on how inescapable soap opera can be, on how dominant in our thinking. So we turn to things like the dumbest possible series on television. Oh, we binge watch. How many of you out there binge watch? Because this is sort of a way of going into this endless cycle of some story that you're sort of caught up in. And the more that you're caught up in this by virtue of binge watching, the more you can hopefully turn your mind off to the soap opera that is you. You are the soap opera. Do you want to be? Do you want to be? Who was it who said, Fritz Perls, the Gestalt therapy guy years ago, talking about being the hero of your own story? Well, it's not wrong for him to say that, but whether it's terribly illuminating, I don't know. I don't know. Is our general tendency to couple, a human general tendency to couple, and other species have it too. Pigeons have it, okay? Birds do it, bees do it, even sophisticated fleas do it. But pigeons, are monogamous. They couple. And here we think about them just flapping around and pecking at the ground, and they couple, and they're quite nice to one another. I knew someone years and years ago who was very much into pigeons. So, this coupling thing, why do we couple? Many people, it seems to me, from what I've observed, sometimes couple for soap opera reasons, or financial reasons, or economic reasons, or just, well, heck, I thought, aren't we supposed to do that sort of thing in life? And isn't it about time that we do this? And how long has it been since, you were with somebody? People have this feeling they need to be with somebody. So they kind of let it happen to themselves, or more often than that, they engineer it. They kind of make it happen somehow, and then they're there, and it's like, oh, darn, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? That co-sensuality isn't there. That tenderness isn't there. That mutuality, that sense of playfulness, the sense of playfulness isn't there. What is there exactly? It's like it's two people scramble off to their jobs or whatever and come back, and they're running a household. It's like running a small shop somewhere. It's the same thing. Come home, run the household. Make sure it's clean and there's food on the table and things that are broke get fixed and all this kind of stuff, and they scramble off to their jobs again. Run, come back. Same thing. Year after year after year. What's the big deal for people? They're planning a vacation, or they're going to buy another house. And we talked about this a couple of moments ago. They're doing the standard stuff. Having another kid, blah, blah, goes on. And then it's bizarre. It's kind of like this coupling for what? This coupling for what? In the meanwhile, of course, they've all got their soap operas going on out there anyway with their jobs and their families and their friends and all that kind of stuff. What's it all about, Alfie, if your name happens to be Alfie? What is it all about? What was that song? Where is the love? It's a good question. Where is the love? Where is the sensuality? Where is the eroticism? Where is the lust? Lust is a nice word. One should feel lust for one's partner. Why not feel lust for one's partner? If you don't want anyone else to feel lust for your partner, well, then you gosh darn better feel lust for them yourself. That's your job. One of your jobs. I shouldn't say that's your job. If it doesn't give you pleasure, if it doesn't make you really excited and happy to feel lust and express lust for your partner, then what are you in a partnership for? What are you coupled for? Somebody else, if they're a halfway attractive person, as I said just a moment ago, someone else is going to do that. And then where are you? Where are you? Will, your partner do something about it? Will they jump into bed with that other person? Will they become very emotionally entangled with that other person? And they're with you and they're thinking, I sure wish that I could be with Jim instead. I sure wish I could be with Sally instead of you, because you're so cold, or because, you don't express lust for me, or because there's no promise of anything. That other person on the side, so to speak, offers a promise, offers a vision, offers a dream of sensuality, offers a dream, a real validation, a word that my good friend uses in her podcast, a dream of love. That other person offers a dream of love. And maybe it's just in your mind. You see this other person, you're close, and you feel, wow, this person offers me a dream of love. It's probably the farthest thing from their mind. But you imagine, you conceptualize that other person offers you a dream of love. Going through life like that. And that's another layer of the soap opera. So, live in a better kind of movie. Higher budget. Better actors. Better scripts. Not like the kind of thing that maybe your mom used to flip on from time to time and watch out of the corner of her eye with those bad archetypes speaking bad dialogue. Be eloquent with your partner. Be poetic. Yeah, poetic with your partner. Sing with your partner. Dance with your partner. Even if you're just in your house, dance with your partner. But as I said a moment ago, and I'm repetitious myself from time to time, be eloquent. Be poetic. Be expressive. Be expressive with your body and with your words. Find things as you go through life in which you can both share and experience joy, whether it's a book, a piece of music, a piece of art, a movie. Well, that's people used to do that, I'm going to share this wonderful movie with you. I tried to do that once upon a time with someone I was involved with, and boy, that didn't work out so well. Because boy, she sat there and insisted that I admit that her opinion was correct and that it was a bad movie. But I mean, it is for a lot of film fans. When there used to be serious films, they would share movies, and it would be just such a great experience. I saw this movie, I heard about it, and you've got to see it. I read this book, you've got to read it. There's this piece of music, a song or some classical piece, whatever I heard, you've got to listen to it. I want to listen to it with you. I want to see it with you. I went to a great restaurant. I want to go there with you. My friend told me about a fabulous place on the shore, in the mountains, a wonderful hike, wonderful visions, wonderful scenery. I want to go there with you. The first thing that comes to your mind when you hear about something wonderful should be, I want to do that with my beloved. I want to share that with my beloved. This is what I want. This is what gives life its meaning and joy. Not to live in isolation and almost solipsistic isolation. What gives my meaning and joy is to discover things that I can experience together with my beloved, and that she or he will do the same thing. It's always got to be mutual. That's what I love. Go out there, and heck, sometimes it's, your lover has gone out there and with your understanding and consent has had a sexual experience with someone else, which is an open kind of situation, and comes back and says, I did this amazing thing with Jim or Joe or Prudence or whatever the person's name is. I want to do it with you. And it could be something sexual. That's fine. The desire to experience wonderful things, beautiful things, fantastic things, uplifting things, joyous things, playful things, together with your beloved. That is what it's all about. That's what frees us from the soap opera. That is what elevates us above the soap opera. This is what gives us our own sense of self-determination in life, our own sense of achievement in life, our own sense of creativity in life, our own sense of direction in life. This is what it's all about. I'm going to return just for a moment to this entire question of why we want to get into a relationship anyway. How is a relationship different from friendship, for example? That's a good question. Can relationships, sexual, romantic relationships, evolve out of friendships? I'm a little bit on the fence about that question in my experience and the experience of other people I've known. And sometimes that phenomenon occurs where one becomes, in love with a good friend, and then one waits for a while and one expresses it, and the person on the other side says, I don't see you that way. I never thought of it that way. And, you're not the kind of person that I would ever have feelings like that about, even though we spent all kinds of time together and do all sorts of stuff together. No, 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 no. That ain't how I see you. A lot of things end like that way. I've had experiences like that, and believe me, I know many people who've had experiences that way, and they walk away just, horrible. And then that's kind of takes us back to the whole notion of, well, then you have to define the sexual, romantic relationship, proto-relationship, possible relationship notion from the very outset, from the very beginning. We're going on a date not just to hang out. We're going on a date because just maybe a couple of dates from now we'll end up in the sack, and just maybe a year from now we'll get married. It's got to be the premise. It's got to be the pretext. It's got to be the model. It's got to be the destination implied of the situation between two people. And I look at that and I kind of say, oh, yuck. I say kind of, oh, yuck. Is that really how it is? Is that really how it is? Yeah, it is how it is, in a strange kind of way. Relationships and sexual encounters can arise out of friendships, but they usually require that kind of pre-definition. And is that pre-definition helpful? Because in a certain way, you're never really talking about real stuff. You're never really getting to know each other outside of this definition of, well, maybe we're going to screw tonight, or maybe we're going to, neck and pet, or maybe we're going to end up at the altar, or shattering the glass, or whatever that procedure is that you go through. And maybe we'll be in the obstetrics ward, and one of us is going to be having a baby, and the other one of us is going to go, oh boy, I'm so excited. I'm going to have a son or a daughter, all that kind of thing. And the kind of real stuff, interpersonal stuff, never happens, and it's bizarre. It's bizarre. Should things be this way? Is this our destiny, to behave this way, to organize our lives this way? Well, perhaps it is, but this kind of is my weird way of circling around to something that I was very much thinking about. I recorded a little bit of this earlier, and then I decided, it ain't finished. I'm going to come back and do some more. So here I am, doing some more before I wind this thing up. People talk about everything in life in terms of growth. That's a word that I shy away from a little bit. What are we growing anyway? It's like, are we growing a new limb? It's a kind of strange thing. It's like the plant in the garden, and it's grown 2 inches this year, or the child, he's grown another inch, something like that. It's a weird word. I'm going to shy away from it in a certain kind of a way. I'm going to go back and read you a few sentences from a fairly recent episode I did on the subject of, synesthesia. But rather than talking at all about synesthesia, I'm going to read you a couple of things. Christopher Watkin, senior lecturer in French studies at Monash University in Australia, is that how they say it? States, recently deceased French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy's radical emancipation rejects a determinate essence of the human in favor of understanding the human as a gesture self-surpassing, emancipating the human form from any constraining essential concept of the subject. The human as the subject. I'm the subject of my life. I'm what it's all about. I'm adding, this is not what he said, I am the I pronoun in every sentence. I am the me to whom things happen, the objective. It happened to me. I opened the refrigerator. I lost a fortune. Somebody punched me in the stomach. I am the I and the me, the subject of everything that's going on. Jean-Luc Nancy explicitly says on this topic, the topic of what the subject is, in his work Corpus, which means body. Bodies aren't some kind of fullness or filled space. Space is filled everywhere. We did a little digression about that, about space-time atoms, and Faye Dowker, the British physicist, who was the person who delivered the eulogy at Stephen Hawking's funeral. But I'm going to start the sentence again. Bodies aren't some kind of fullness or filled space. After all, space is filled everywhere. Bodies are an open space, implying, in some sense, space more properly spacious. We're all an open space. Dig it. We need to abandon the distinction between the senses and the world, even between the senses and society. Since for Jean-Luc Nancy, the senses, and the world are inseparably intertwined. And I, being the radical that I am, I would go on and say sense, the so-called soul, the so-called spirit, consciousness, the mind, subconscious, the preconscious, the unconscious, are all inseparably intertwined with society and with the world, which is not to imply anything like a collective unconscious. Per a psychologist I don't particularly care for, Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud famously said, well, there's no such thing as a collective unconscious, but it's kind of collective anyway, and no need to go further with that. Anyway, Jean-Luc Nancy tells us that the uncontrollable, the synesthetic dissemination of the senses resists any attempt to impose rational, intelligible order or to make sense. So that's a little digression, a little aside, and I'm going to now go back to just rapping on what I was rapping about before, and that is, instead of the idea of growth, I like the idea of expansion. But even that's kind of a spatial metaphor that bothers me a little bit. I like the idea of the individual constantly being inclusive of new ideas, new thoughts, new perceptions, new feelings, new physical sensations, new places, new exposures to various aspects of the world and of the universe, constantly open, never closed, as Jean-Luc Nancy was saying, just expanding on forever. And, this expansion can take many forms. Travel. Someone I knew, I even referenced earlier, said that she wanted to visit a new country, I wish there were more continents. It would be wonderful to say, I'm going to visit a new continent every year for the 100 years of my life. Wouldn't that be grand? We have to go out of this world to do that. But there's an openness here. There's an openness, a sense of wonder in this inclusiveness, the willingness to include the new, the unexpected in terms of things that your mind can do that maybe you didn't realize your mind can do, your body can do, maybe that you didn't realize that your body can do. Parapsychology, they talk about those sorts of experiences. We did a show a little while back where we demonstrated that certain forms of Tantra and certain aspects of the chakras, which are discussed under Tantra, can open up psi abilities, paranormal abilities, as they call them. Silly word. Everything is paranormal because there is no such thing as normal. Any concept of the normal is a concept of entrapment. Like in law enforcement, you're being entrapped into being something that you don't want to be. You're being entrapped into the crime of being normal. Think about it. You're being entrapped. You're being set up to being normal. And then they're going to come and arrest you one day and say, you're just normal. We're going to lock you away in a coffin, cremate you because you're guilty of the crime of being normal. So what the bleep does this have to do with relationships, romance, sex, and all of that kind of stuff? What this is, and it's referring back to something in a certain way that I talked about before, and that is that I want to be with someone, whether they're a friend, even an employer, but particularly someone with whom I am intimate, with whom I share those private moments, those not only sexual moments, but those moments of intimacy in terms of we are what's going on. the two of us, it's our story now for sure. It's our story without the encumbrances of the soap opera. I want to, it's not, we talked a lot about sharing a little bit before, but I want to do this kind of thing of inciting expansion, bodily expansion, psychic expansion, philosophical expansion, spiritual expansion in the person I'm with, and I want her to do that to me all the time, but I want her to do that significantly, to bring new things to my experience. I want to do that back to her. It's all about this kind of constant enrichment of each other. Given the fact that, as Jean-Luc Nancy and others, trust me, others have said that the body is not this static, fixed thing, that the mind is not this static, fixed thing, that the self, we talked about a moment before, so-called self, is not this static, fixed thing, that the I you use as the subject, quote-unquote, of sentences is not the same I that you used a few years ago, perhaps. Now, this is not to imply that we're always abandoning former, previous selves and replacing them with something else. The happy, carefree, wonderful self of my 20s was replaced by the cynical, non-optimistic, deadpan, reserved, non-comprehending self of my, say, late 30s. Pick a year. That ain't what happens. And it is a good. People talk about the inner child. There's also, in a certain way, the inner teenager. Well, I want to free my inner child. Oh, that's great stuff. It's but you also have to remember that kind of inner teenager. That's the time when you really kind of we're excited. We're excited about the idea that maybe I'm going to end up in a car parked somewhere, and maybe I'm going to end up kissing this person that I'm with, whom I kind of like. There's kind of excitement of that. Maybe I'm going to look through a college catalog for the very first time. I had that experience. I was in the 8th grade, and I'd never seen a college catalog before, and I never realized that it was possible to major in music. And I remember telling my father that, and it was kind of like, well, yeah, that's possible, but you should really go to the Naval Academy, his big thing, or you should really do something that leads you into law school. So what happens if you have a degree in music? Well, it's in a certain way, it's not such a bad question. It's like the thing that I was referencing earlier, study something that you love, and you'll never work a day in your life because there are no jobs in that field. And that's a somewhat cynical comment, but not one without some relevance. So you want to call it expansion, call it expansion. You want to call it growth, call it growth. Call it whatever you want to call it. But I want someone who is going to constantly open me up to new ideas, thoughts, experiences, places, things I can do with my body, things I can do with my mind, things I can do in society, if that's your big thing. I want to have that incitement. Not just exposure. I want the sort of excitement. I want someone with a kind of energy to really get me excited about new and different things. I want to play back and forth with that person with ideas. I want to play back and forth with that person with physical things. I want to play back and forth with that person about philosophy, spiritual things, travels, all kinds of different things. I want that constant exchange, intellectual exchange, with the person I'm with, and I want her to have that desire to me, and that reason. So many of us have things on the inside that we have a difficult time sharing with people we know. If you're talking to somebody and you're talking about home repair, you're talking about fixing your car, you're talking about buying a new this, that, or the other thing, and there's so much inside that is never going to come up in conversations like that. Some interesting thought that you had, just randomly. You heard something on the news. You read a little something in the newspaper. You read a little something, heard a little something online or in a podcast, maybe even this one. And who are you going to talk about that with? Some people, you just bring it up in a conversation and they think, boy, this person is really out there today. Why isn't he thinking about the things people should be thinking about? Where to invest his money? What to do with his 401k if that's the time of his life? Should he open an IRA? Should he get into Bitcoin? Should he, devote everything to the study of crypto? And if you think about Jean-Luc Nancy or Maurice Merleau-Ponty or any of those people, you think about some interesting musical piece that you heard that wasn't the kind of normal thing. It wasn't the latest thing from the now pregnant Rihanna or anything but thing like that. It was something completely new and different and bizarre. And is that there's a certain kind of friend who will be open to that kind of thing, but a lot of friends will not be. You want that person who is open to you. You want that person who is open to you. And a person who will not be bored to tears or think you're weird or an impractical human being. If your mind turns to such things, if your conversation turns to such things, expansion, excitement, incitement, and excitement, 2 words together, this is life. This is love. Love should always have an element, a factor, a driving force of excitement. I used earlier the word lust. Lust is a great thing to have in a relationship, but there's also a kind of emotional lust, and on top of that there's a intellectual lust, a lust for what is going on in the other person's mind. I am turned on by what you're thinking. I am turned on by the desire to know your reaction to things. Turned on. Excited. My whole body and mind and spirit, which in my opinion are all the same thing, are excited by wanting to know what's going on inside. And when you share it with me, oh my God, this in turn is like something that turns the flame on my side. It's this constant play of 2 fires. This constant play of 2 sparks becoming new fires elsewhere. This is what it's all about. And going back to the song I quoted earlier, what's love got to do with it? Well, this is love. This is the love of a burning passion for the new. And does this end up with more excitement in the bedroom? Oh yeah, the bedroom. Oh yeah, for sure. Because what happens there is the sexual manifestation of what is going on between you two as this source of warmth, source of fire, source of incitement, source of excitement that's going on all along. It's just one more aspect to it. It's just one more way of manifesting it. That's what that sexual stuff is all about. And in the synesthesia episode, I quoted a chap named Donald Mosher, a professor, PhD of philosophy at University of Connecticut, or psychology probably. And he talked a lot about the interesting phases of lovemaking, the interesting phases and styles and manners and aspects of relationships and of leading up to the sexual situation. And what he had to say was pretty good. But like all professors, it was a little bit lacking in this kind of passion. Curiously, he did not talk about the intellectual aspects, the thought aspects that go into developing this kind of proto-sexual situation that ends up in sex and marriage and children and life and death and all those things that face us all. But I figured, well, maybe I better talk about those things. In a certain way, that's what this podcast is for. The word explore in the title of this podcast is not there by accident. The word ecstatic in the title of this podcast is not there by accident. Think about both of those words. The constant need to explore in your own mind and in the mind and body of your partner, whether it's a sex partner for the night or a life sex love partner. Ecstatic, to be ecstatic about what's going on in your mind, to be ecstatic about what's going on in your partner's mind, to be ecstatic about love, to be ecstatic about life. In sensuality, in the synesthesia episode, I was quoting a number of people, I think a couple of Russians and Ukrainians, but not only them. I was talking about how sensual, there is no real experience of any aspect of the world, one of these Russians, I think, said, without experiencing it sensually. So much of what is going on in the world is wrong because we lose the sensuality of things. And you're talking only about politics. We're talking only about foreign relations and all this kind of stuff. The moment you think about things sensually, it kind of makes sense. I don't want to die in a war. Well, that's sensual, you know. The feeling of being murdered is not something that you want to experience sensually. Keep that sensual element in play all the time. Explore ecstatic sensuality. Ludwig Wittgenstein was an originally Austrian philosopher who was part of the same generation which gave us such giants as my favorite composer, Arnold Schoenberg, Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, Alban Berg, Sigmund Freud, and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Unlike those other people whom I mentioned in the immediately preceding sentence, Wittgenstein was, in my opinion, no such giant. In fact, he set much of 20th century philosophy on a dubious linguistic detour, at the terminus of which was a small town in Nebraska with nothing but a long-shuttered filling station and lots of empty vending machines. Thomas Raleigh, professor of philosophy at the University of Luxembourg, wrote a book chapter entitled Wittgenstein, Spatial Phenomenology, and the Private Language Argument, which reminds us of perhaps the most often quoted and argued about pronouncement that Wittgenstein ever made. Section 243 of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations reads, "But could we imagine a language in which a person could write down or give vocal expression to his inner experiences, his feelings, moods, and the rest, for his private use? But can't we do that with ordinary language? But that is not what I, Wittgenstein, mean. The individual words of this language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his individual private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language, a language which only describes predicates of an inner, private domain, i.e., whose meaning is only descriptive of private properties, could only be understood by the subject in question. It would be an incommunicative language." But here we must return to Jean-Luc Nancy's view on the nature of the subject and how the senses and the world are the same thing, and also on Slavoj Žižek's commentary on this as mentioned in our episode on synesthesia. According to Thomas Raleigh, what this all comes down to is that to express the qualitative nature of, quote, private phenomenal features would require a new language, which is to say, new predicates. Such a new language would be understood only by the subject in question, and thus would be an incommunicative language, thus an incomprehensible language to anyone else. And to follow Wittgenstein's argument through to its logical conclusion, such a language would be impossible. So, much of 20th century philosophy was based on the writings of a philosopher who believed that to communicate, quote, private phenomenal features to someone else could not be done. Someone might be tempted to make the sardonic observation, isn't what this dude is really saying, keep your feelings to yourself? Keep what's going inside you to yourself. How many times have you heard that, if not with your ears, with your other senses? Even in relationships? A private language is a putative language, the meanings of whose expressions are essentially grounded in the subjective or private states of the users of the language. The notion was first employed by Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations in order to refute both classical and contemporary conceptions of linguistic meaning. This notion remains at the center of Wittgenstein's scholarship and has a highly controversial use in philosophy of language and indeed in philosophy of mind more generally. In his book, The Language of Thought, Jerry A. Fodor makes, among other claims, the following two. A. Wittgenstein's private language argument isn't really any good, and B. Wittgenstein's argument is anyway not really against Fodor's own theory of the language of thought. But what about the possibility of a lover's private language? Many, most, sensually and emotionally and spiritually and intellectually intertwined and engaged couples have a private language of gestures, touches, glances, not to mention kisses and specifically erotic physical manifestations. And they, thus, have a private language of the senses, of shared, often synesthetic responses to colors, sounds, and olfactory sensations. But do they not also have a verbal private language? Of course there are those terms of affection and endearment in which couples address one another in fond absurdities. However, they also have a private language more inclusive than that, sometimes also synesthetic. Lovers have a way of turning love into speech, into love understanding, into love grammar, into love syntax, into love cathedrals, into love pyramids, into love poetry, into love manifestos, and into love knowing. Wittgenstein had affairs with several men and also with a woman or two, but he had only one real love in his life, Ben Richards. Your presenter, by contrast, has had 4 great loves, only 2 of which were actuated, you might say. Is consummated a better word? That always sounds to me like a thin broth, but perhaps with those others in the next life. No, I may not get a sequel for that purpose. And then there is this thing called retrocausality, as discussed by, among others, the Australian philosopher Hugh Price, now at Cambridge University in merry old England. Can the present influence the past? The argument against this is that you might be driving with your grandmother as a passenger and have an accident which was fatal to her. But would not such an accident also be fatal to you? It is easy to imagine actions which you might perform which would nullify the possibility of your existence. However, retrocausality is the real deal in other dimensions of thought and experience. Hugh Price even employs it as an argument against what Einstein referred to as spooky action at a distance. But we'll sidestep that for a moment. It is an everyday occurrence for things that we say today to make incomprehensible things we said 2 weeks ago suddenly make sense. In the lives of lovers, the present, the past, and the future are intertwined in a good way. Time's arrow, Hugh Price's term, does not always shoot forward. Meaning lives in a realm apart from clock time, apart from digital time. And so does love. If someone says to you, as someone once said to me, "I have always loved you. Even when I was a child, I was drawing your picture, knowing that someday I would meet you." When someone says things to you along those lines, they are not necessarily wrong, and they are not necessarily playing a manipulative game with you. In our episode entitled The Male Orgasm, Sex and Yoga, the Chakras unleash Psi's psychic power, the Animus and the Anima, learn to defeat shame with self-love, which I foisted upon the universe on November 20, 2021, we spoke about the chakras. I fervently suggest that you, dear listener, listen to this episode as well as to all episodes of this podcast going back to episode 1. For the moment, I'm going to remind you of some information I imparted during that episode. The 3 body-mind sets exist and operate in different dimensions, each maintained by the type of prana, vital energy, necessary and appropriate for that dimension. This does not mean that they are separate entities, but rather that they are parts of an organic whole. Each body-mind, each of our body-minds, has within itself energy centers for controlling the flow of prana in a system of energy channels. These channels are called nadis, and the centers controlling them are known as chakras. Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama of the Institute of Religion and Psychology in Japan and his group designed several laboratory instruments specifically developed to study the chakras. Dr. Motoyama and his colleagues found that psychic ability, does seem to be connected to the specific chakras supposedly responsible for them, and in different ways, namely the Anahata chakra and the Muladhara chakra. He found supportive evidence of the traditional notion that psi abilities can be classified into two types, the powers of reception and the powers of generation. The powers of reception seem to be linked to the lower chakras and the powers of generation to the higher chakras. Curiously, Dr. Motoyama appears not to have been interested in what most people think of when the topic of, quote, psychic powers, unquote, comes up. Yes, quote, powers of reception, unquote, covers some of that, the ability to, as it were, read someone else's mind. But equally, actually more important, are psychic, psi abilities having to do with time. That's why there are houses with standard-issue psychic reader signs in front of them in many neighborhoods, informing passers-by that the person inside the house can tell you both if such and such an individual is in love with you, mind reading, and what your future will bring. If you and the object of your love will end up at the altar, or, alas, if she will end up there with someone else, with that flirty pendejo from the 99 cents only store, or if you will win the lottery and thus win her back, win her heart. In David Lynch's astounding third season of Twin Peaks, a character who appears in a fantasy environment says in a voice that sounds like it is playing backwards, but isn't, "Is it the past, or is it future?" As one considers the perspective of one's mind, and here I should say that what that perception shows us are representations both of what is thought and what is perceived sensorially, how is that distinction between past and future made? When we were speaking in our episode on synesthesia of objectum sexualis, a phenomenon in which a person experiences emotional, romantic, and or sexual feelings toward inanimate objects, psychologists who conducted research in this matter concluded that, quote, personification, rather than personhood, may be the necessary prerequisite for romantic love to arise, unquote. The opening sentence of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer's seminal work, The World as Will and Representation, is Die Welt ist meine Vorstellung. The world is my representation. However, philosopher Richard Akia has suggested that Vorstellung should instead be translated as presentation. The world that we perceived can be understood as a presentation of objects in the theater of our mind. Schopenhauer argues that what does this presenting, what sets the world as a presentation before us, is the cognizant subject itself. Stay tuned for a discussion later in this episode of what the subject might mean, what the notion of a subject might entail, and on what basis a subject might be able to do any presentation of objects in the theater of our mind. How could they do it? And then, of course, there is time. The subject doing the presentation might place objects, including people, in the past, or place objects in the future. Is the presenter, the presenting subject, ever really in the now? The presenter is always rearranging the past, even what was perceived sensorially a moment ago, and digesting the past, while at the same time not only anticipating, but attempting to project a desired vision of how to arrange objects, including people, in the future. The subject is timeless. The subject exists in the realm of retrocausality and of a psychic power, which we all believe in, the power to make things happen. And just as an aside, in Tantra, and this is something which we will be discussing with an advanced expert, Anita Di Francesco, in an upcoming episode, there are what are known as siddhis, which can be achieved through the practice of yoga. These include the siddhi of prakamya, the ability to realize whatever one desires. But this can only be achieved by progressing through many steps of advanced yoga and meditation. The belief that we all have such ability, the ability to make things happen, is ingrained at the deepest level of our psyches and is something that makes us human, distinguishes us from perhaps other species, or maybe not. One view of so-called aliens is that they have this ability. They have this ability big time. And certainly, humans developed their notion of gods on the basis of the idea that they had this ability, the ability to make things happen. Gods were like humans, had human skills, only they were better at stuff. However, to return to the conclusion drawn by the researchers into object sexuality, and their idea, presented to us with no reference to Arthur Schopenhauer, that to personify the object of one's affection and desire is to take what is perceived as an object, perhaps in Jacques Lacan's word, objet petit a, the unattainable object of desire, and personify that object by, if you will, objectifying it, and then personifying that object. Objectify, turn the presentation in your mind of the person you desire, you love, you have affection for, turn it into an object, put it on the stage, the theater of your mind, and then personify that object, which is no longer a person but a representation of a person, as an anthropomorphic act. So it is not the person who is the prerequisite for romantic love to arise, but the personification of that person which is formed in the attracted person's mind. In this setup, per Schopenhauer and per these researches, is it ever really possible to fall in love? But then again, we return just for a second to the notion of the spiritual spot. Much is said, and correctly, about sacred sexuality, which to me should really be spoken of as sacred sexuality / sacred love. Why not say that? Why not just come out and say that in the open? Talk about love. It is sacred. There is a sacred feminine, and the sacred feminine is part, not the whole thing, but a part of, a woman's spiritual spot, the spiritual place inside of her. Furthermore, it is the man's sacred duty to honor his beloved's spiritual spot and to honor her sacred femininity, to pay homage to it as a power of love, peace, and if I may say, of the rationality of love. The rationality of love. There is a mode of psychological thinking which classifies the man as the rational and the woman as the instinctual, the emotional. In my view, this is just one more misogynist effort to say that whenever a real-world, practical analysis of a situation is called for, it falls to the man to make that analysis to arrive at a rational course of action. However, man is driven so much by ego, so much by a desire to appear dominant not only with women, but with the world as a whole, that his supposed rationality is just another weapon he uses. The sacred feminine includes feminine rationality. Sure, that rationality has instinctual and emotional elements, but it also includes analytical elements not corroded by a lust for dominance. And yes, there is a rationality of love. Love can be wild, can and should be, to borrow the wonderful expression of Anita Di Francesco, a wild dance. And love-making in particular needs to be this way. But the structure of love, the management of falling in love and working through its aspects and nuances must be sane, deliberate, considered, and neither neurotic, obsessional, nor psychotic, by which I mean destructive to either or both parties in the developing relationship. And this feminine rationality of love, comes from a woman's spiritual spot, which is a place inside of her. There is such a thing as place. We're going to return to that in a little while. But back to what Einstein didn't like, as expressed most notably in his famous Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper of the 1930s. Somewhere I talked about tachyons, particles that move faster than the speed of light. And brother, he sure would have hated those. If they had been on Einstein's menu, he would have ordered the proton salad instead. There is this thing called entanglement. If two particles are entangled, and here we're referring to the language of quantum mechanics following more the Niels Bohr train of thought, and by entangled we mean that they have the same polarity, either positive or negative. So if you change the polarity, the sign, if you will, of one particle, the other changes as well, so that they are then both the same, both positive or both negative. And then, if you separate these particles in space, so there is no physical or any other contact between them, and again you change the polarity of one particle, the other particle changes too. Like the church-top bells in La Ventura. First, Monica Vitti leans on, or maybe pulls, it's hard to tell, one bell rope, and then bells from other churches sound at a distance. So Claudia and Sandro pull other ropes, this time deliberately, with reckless deliberation and irresponsible intent. The entangled bells of, maybe of love? Or of their search for the missing Anna. Do they really want to find her? Maybe, maybe not. Because at this point, Claudia and Sandro are themselves in love with each other. But they had already kissed on the yacht before disembarking to explore the ecstatic crags of Lisca Bianca. The potentialities have already been made manifest. But sometimes the absence of potentialities is also palpable, in your face, like a cold wind with no remorse, an attraction that had nowhere to go, like a dead man's eyes on an uneaten meal. Sometimes it is best to permit one's appetites to die. Spooky, action at a distance, something that gave Einstein a heartburn, if not a headache. One reads of twins being entangled, that's the word, entangled, in ways like that. So our question is, in what ways are couples entangled? Is such entanglement positive, or can it be negative? We have all known or heard of couples like that, couples that are bonded or attached in a way that prevents further, if I may use the word that I have mixed feelings about, growth. That are bonded or attached in such a way that prevents further expansion, inward or outward. Perhaps the solution for such couples is polyamory, is to consider having a mutually open relationship, is to let more love in so that this over-attached, over-bonded, over-entangled love does not fester, a rot on the vine, so to speak. Let's play around with some of these ideas. Private language, love language, retrocausality, entanglement, in a different way. There are sentences known as counterfactuals. Example, if I had kissed Sophia in a different way, then she would have fallen in love with me. Then there are what are called irrealis counterfactuals. If it were warm and not windy right now, then I would be out hiking. Irrealis counterfactuals can undergo conditional inversion. Were it warm and not windy, I would be out hiking. What is relevant here, and to our previous discussions, is what the eminent philosopher David Kellogg Lewis, who actually wrote a famous book entitled Counterfactuals, had to say about such things. In its original formulation, Lewis, in his book on the Plurality of Words, posed the philosophical view known as modal realism, which states that all possible worlds are real in the same way as is the actual world. They are, to quote Lewis, of a kind with this world of ours. Modal realism is based on the following tenets. Possible worlds exist. Possible worlds are not different in kind from the actual world. Possible worlds are irreducible entities. The term actual in actual world is indexical, which is to say that any subject can declare their world to be an actual one, much as they label the place they are, here, and the time they are, now. What made Lewis's views about counterfactuals controversial is that whereas Stallnacher treated possible worlds as imaginary entities made up for the sake of theoretical convenience, Lewis adopted a position his formal account of counterfactuals did not commit him to. In Lewis's formulation, when we speak of a world where I made the shot that in this world I missed, we're speaking of a world just as real as this one. And although we say that in that world I made the shot, more precisely it is not I, but a counterpart of mine who was successful, which is to say, a counterpart of mine in another world which exists. So a counterpart of mine in another world, just as real as this one, kissed Sophia in a manner which induced her to fall in love with me. In another world, the woman I loved, with whom physicality was not consummated, was in fact consummated by a counterpart of mine. In another world. In a world which exists. According to Lewis, actual is merely an indexical label we give a world when we are in it. Things are only necessarily true when they are true in all possible worlds, which in my opinion means that nothing is necessarily true. Repeat after me. There'll be a quiz in the morning. Nothing is necessarily true. When Lewis tells us that there is a plurality of worlds in which a counterpart of mine is doing things that I am not doing in this world, and that, for this counterpart of mine, that world is for him an actual world, this returns us once again to the entire notion of the subject. How can these counterparts of mine retain any identity with me? How can they have, if you will, a consistency? French philosopher Alain Badiou has written a tetralogy of important philosophical treatises, just as I have written a tetralogy of novels. I must say that my tetralogy has more sex, action, love affairs, crime, and intimations of our possible destinies than Badiou's does. But back to our main subject here. The first volume of Badiou's tetralogy, published in 1982, had the title Theory of the Subject. In this work, Badiou theorizes the subject as a, quote, destructive consistency, an expression which really hits home with me, and which requires us to return, for the moment, to someone who makes at least one guest appearance in each episode of this podcast, namely Jacques Lacan. Borrowing a paragraph from Ed Pluth's book, Signifiers and Acts, quote, if Slavoj Žižek's portrayal of the Lacanian subject tends to make it too transcendental and phenomenological, then the work of another prominent theorist of subjectivity, Judith Butler, tends to go in the opposite direction. Butler theorizes a subject that is immanent in the discourses that constitute it. Furthermore, on Butler's terms, it is difficult to imagine a subject who ever does anything other than perform an identity. However, the act in the thinking of Jacques Lacan shows us involved in a practice beyond identity and beyond the pursuit of recognition. This stops me dead in my tracks, so to speak. Have you ever known people who do very little beyond performing their identity, beyond the pursuit of recognition? I observe certain people, and that appears to be pretty much all of what they are doing. Where does the identity that they are performing come from? And does that identity have a consistency? Perhaps in Badiou's words, a consistency which is indeed destructive, since it is woefully repetitious? But back to Alain Badiou's book, Theory of the Subject. Badiou's notion that, quote, everything that exists is thus at the same time itself according to its place, a hyphenated expression as is typical of many philosophers, including Badiou, also implicates that every being is split between the actual, in quotes, and the potential, in quote, being. Every substantial way of being is contingent on the placement of that being, irrespective of the placed element itself. I immediately ask about that counterpart of mine in the other world, and how he got there, how he was placed there. He is, if we are to follow Badiou, himself according to his place, hyphenated. Attempting to graft Badiou onto David K. Lewis, is it not possible that it is each of our counterparts that exist in those other worlds, which are constantly branching off until there are trillions of them, who are our potential beings? Those counterparts in other worlds, are they our potential beings? I ask again. And do my counterparts out there in those other worlds also have their own counterparts that are their potential beings? Alain Badiou's primary interest is not to elaborate different ways of determination, Bestimmung, of the being of elements. Rather, the greatest attention is paid to the logics of the space of placement of objects and the ontological preconditions of the capacity and the force of placement. Every actualized placement depends on the, quote, illusory repetition of its closure onto itself. Think about that with the echo of Freud's identification of repetition with our desire to achieve homeostasis, stillness in all of our being, with death. So, my actualized placement, your actualized placement, your being, in quotes, in a place, is based on the illusory repetition of that placement's closure onto itself. Whereas Lacan described the new construction of a structure as the result of jouissance, Badiou locates the origin of order in the trust and confidence in the inner consistency in the structure. Now, far be it from me to say anything critical of Alain Badiou, but look around at you and ask yourself, what trust can we have in the inner consistency in the structure of vision, of perception, of personality, of anything? What is internally consistent in our world? So, anyway, I'm going to go back and read this sentence again without my little emendation or addition or aside. Whereas Jacques Lacan described the new construction of a structure as the result of jouissance, and we're going to define jouissance again for you guys in a moment, Badiou locates the origin of order in the trust and confidence in the inner consistency in the structure. The subject effect is accordingly located on the level of the psyche of the subject and its affinity toward consistency. I stop again. Does the subject have an affinity toward consistency? Yes and no. So we start the paragraph once more. Whereas Lacan described the new construction of a structure as the result of jouissance, Badiou locates the origin of order in the trust and confidence in the inner consistency in the structure. The subject effect is accordingly located on the level of the psyche of the subject and its affinity toward consistency is the very order of the simulacrum of the one, the structure, as the superior structure, the one. We've criticized this notion of any kind of one out there. However, if there is, per David Lewis, a plurality of worlds, how can the psyche of the subject, quote, have affinity toward consistency in the very origin of the one, the structure, as the superior structure? In Lewis's multiverse, not his term necessarily, there is no longer one, something which I have argued in many episodes of this podcast and argue again today in my discussion of the plurality of worlds and what is going on in those worlds, who I am in those worlds. Since we have just employed the Lacanian term jouissance, which is a perfectly normal French word meaning enjoyment, including enjoyment of orgasm, perhaps we had better say something about what jouissance meant for Lacan in the development of his thought. Quote, there is a jouissance beyond the pleasure principle, linked to the partial drive, a jouissance which compels the subject to constantly attempt to transgress the prohibitions imposed on his enjoyment, to go beyond the pleasure principle. Title of a fantastic book by Freud, which Lacan is, by inference, referencing. Yet, according to Lacan, the result of transgressing the pleasure principle is not more pleasure, but instead pain, since there is only a certain amount of pleasure that the subject can bear. Beyond this limit, pleasure becomes pain, and this painful principle is what Lacan calls jouissance. To state matters simplistically, while simultaneously going beyond what Lacan actually said and thought, one might say that the whole origin of the structure of which the subject is in a certain way the defining element is suffering. I'm going to state that differently. I'm going to state that again. I'm going to say that again. One might say that the whole origin of the structure in which the subject is in a certain way the defining element is suffering. The subject is defined by suffering. Is that true? Can we go beyond that? Should we go beyond that? Then we can think again about something we mentioned earlier. How you will go thoroughly crazy if you start thinking about your status, perhaps status as a cipher, perhaps status as something truly and irrevocably bizarre in the minds of people you know, in the imaginations of people you know, and even conceivably in the imaginations of people you don't know. For when push comes to shove, for 99.999% of the time, that is who you are. And more important, that is where you are. A character in the imaginations of other people. Could it be that, in the terminology of Badiou, your yourself according to your place, your actual being, is your self-perception in, per Lewis, your actual world? And your potential being, Badiou, is what exists in other people's minds? Your dry cleaner knows who you can be, potentially. Your hairdresser knows what you can be, who you are, potentially. What is your status in your beloved's mind? She or he should certainly, must in fact, know who you are potentially, what your potentials are, what you can do in the actual world, per Lewis, rather than leave it to your counterparts in other worlds to do those things, to actualize your potential. It is perhaps comforting to believe that as life splits into multiple worlds, multiple existences, our counterparts are indeed finishing their degrees or losing weight or coming in first in the citywide race in that other world which is the actual world for them. Too many of us allow our counterparts in our imaginations to be the achievers in life while we just schlep along. But that is one thing, as I said a moment ago, that lovers must do for one another, to insist that they actualize in this world, in their shared actual world, in the here and now, rather than in fantasy lives. Let's go back to David K. Lewis and other ways of thinking about the existence of other worlds, parallel worlds, multiple universes, parallel universes, or maybe not so parallel. And is it possible that there are times when we all wish to push that button on the remote and suddenly be in that world where all of our dreams are fulfilled and all of our loves are consummated rather than turned into thin broth to be spooned up unenthusiastically and only when we are on a diet? The idea of the existence of parallel worlds, parallel universes, has had a number of expressions in the deep, deep past. The Gnostics, during that quiet but desperate era in which Christianity was being promulgated as the new state religion while the state itself was dissolving into ruins, well, there are the Sethian Gnostics, whose surviving texts I read and translated from their original sub-acmemic dialect of Coptic, these including the Thunder, Perfect Mind, Shanuta, perhaps the most famous writer in original Coptic, which is to say, writer of Coptic texts not translated from Greek or other originals, wrote that the Gnostics, a term developed much later by scholars, not used at the time, would say, Tishajna nuta entof tamiaen. I hate the God who created us. Nuta, from the ancient Egyptian word netcher in its Coptic manifestation. Why would one say that? Why would these so-called Gnostics say this? Because this God, this Nuta, this netcher, consigned us to an evil world which exists in parallel with a good world. In parallel. Like David Kellogg Lewis's parallel worlds. In the text entitled Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus, dated to the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Christian era, we read, God, having created the universe, then created the divisions, the worlds, and various gods and goddesses whom he appointed to certain parts of the universe. He then took a mysterious transparent substance, out of which he created human souls. He appointed the souls to the astral region, which is just above the physical region. He then assigned the souls to create life on earth. He handed over some of his creative substances to the souls and commanded them to contribute to his creation. The souls then used the substance to create the various animals and forms of physical life. Soon after, however, the souls began to overstep their boundaries. They succumbed to pride and desired to be equal to the highest gods. Gods in plural, I should add. God was displeased and called upon Hermes to create physical bodies that would imprison the souls as a punishment for them. God was displeased and called upon Hermes to create physical bodies that would imprison the souls as a punishment for them. Hermes created physical bodies on earth, and God then told the souls of their punishment. God decreed that suffering would await them in the physical world, but he promised them that if their actions on earth were worthy of their divine origin, their condition would improve and they would eventually return to the heavenly world. If it did not improve, he would condemn them to repeated reincarnation upon earth. Reincarnation upon earth. Ergo, no matter what you do, no matter what you think, no matter what your actions or intentions are in a certain way, this earth is an evil place to which you have been condemned. Condemned. In parallel to such sects, as we would call them today, such sects that really came out of Christianity during this period of the total chaos of the human world, can only be called that. We had, rising from the ashes, if you will, the Manichaeans, one of the most ruthlessly persecuted, ruthlessly vilified, ruthlessly exterminated religions in the history of the planet, because they had the nerve to say that on earth two forces are operating in parallel, good and evil. And the evil was not some kind of little accident or, some kind of a deal like that. Nobody made a mistake to create evil. Nobody transgressed to create evil. Evil's always been here. From their texts, I will read you the following from the Coptic Manichaean Psalm book, as edited by Charles Robert Cecil Albury, who was transmuted into a fictional character by the name of Roy Calvert in C.P. Snow's important novel and one of my favorites, The Light and the Dark. I'm going to read an excerpt from this Coptic Manichaean Psalm book because I think it reflects the feelings, it reflects the worldview, the Weltanschauung of this time, which is perhaps relevant to the times in which we are living today, when the polls and the surveys and the predictors say that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction almost everywhere. So I shall read. Of the darkness and of the fire, it has been said that they shall pass. Of the sphere, it has been said that they shall be destroyed and pass. Of the crowned ones of the kingdom, it has been said that they shall be destroyed and passed. Of the creation and of the Creator, it has been said that they shall perish and pass. The little one makes music by night. Hule, matter, hule in Greek, the word is in Greek in the text. Matter answered him with a word, O little one that makest music, thou art in this world. It is thou who art in this world. He, the little one, said, I indeed am in this world, cosmos, but I shall not dwell in it henceforth. I have tried the world and known it, and there is not even a tiny bit of life in it. Since I have known the world, it has hated me, even the whole world, cosmos. When I saw that it hated me, I, in my turn, hated it. So that was how many people felt back in those dark times. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and to thank the woman who inspired me to undertake the task of doing this podcast. Her name is Anita Di Francesco. She has her own podcast, and that is specifically what inspired me to do this. It is called Discover Joyous Love. And that podcast is a successor to a podcast she did previously called It's Your Voice. Anita Di Francesco is a psychotherapist, a somatic psychotherapist, an authority on organomic therapy and psychotherapy, the work of Wilhelm Reich. She is a renowned author of 2 books, Live Free, Recreate and Liberate Your Life, and the Donna Gentili story, a spellbinding true crime thriller about the murder, the brutal murder of her first cousin and her attempts to identify the killer. I strongly recommend Anita Di Francesco as a relationship counselor, as a psychotherapist, and as someone you should listen to on her podcast. You can find her at 2 websites. One is tantrawisdom.com. The other is discoverjoyouslove.com. She also has Facebook pages, a Facebook page entitled Tantra Wisdom, her Facebook business page, and also Love and Relationship Coach. Check her out. You won't be disappointed.